4 disturbing, true, scary stories that will break your mind. There are some horror stories you hear and forget. And then, there are those that never leave you. The ones that creep into your mind at night. The ones that make you question if you're truly alone. The ones that make you afraid to look into the darkness. Tonight, we bring you 4 terrifying, true, scary stories. Stories so disturbing, so unexplainable, that they will haunt you long after this video ends. A man wakes up from a coma, but something about him is wrong. An abandoned well whispers secrets, and something inside it wants out. A woman sees a face in her 7th floor window, but no one should be there. And a girl hears her father's voice calling her, but she knows he's not home. These are real-life horror stories that will send chills down your spine. Disturbing encounters, eerie doppelgangers, and terrifying paranormal experiences. Stories so unsettling that even skeptics will think twice. Are you brave enough to keep watching? Let's begin. Story 1. The Man Who Came Back Wrong. Part 1. The Awakening. The beeping of the heart monitor was the only thing that broke the sterile silence of the hospital room. Richard had been like this for 6 months, motionless, silent, trapped in a state somewhere between life and death. His family had come and gone throughout the months, their hopeful visits gradually turning into resigned murmurs and quiet sobs in the hospital hallways. The doctors had warned him that he was unlikely to recover. Brain damage was severe. If, by some miracle, he ever woke up, he wouldn't be the same. That's why, when a night shift nurse glanced at Richard's vitals and noticed a sudden spike in activity, she assumed it was a glitch. The machines weren't infallible, after all. She sighed, rubbing her temples as she prepared to reset the monitor. Then, she heard the sound, a wet, guttural gasp. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the hospital bed. Richard was sitting up, not in a slow, gradual way, but abruptly, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head cocked slightly to the left. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused. They didn't dart around the room in confusion, as a coma patient should. They didn't react to the bright hospital lights or the nurse's trembling voice when she whispered his name. They were locked onto something in the farthest corner of the room, something only he could see. The nurse reached for the emergency call button, but before she could press it, Richard spoke. "I can hear them now," he murmured, voice hoarse and dry from months of disuse. The nurse hesitated. "Who, Richard?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Slowly, his lips curled into a smile that seemed stretched unnatural. The ones from the other side. Then every monitor in the room shut off. Part 2. The New Richard. By the time the doctors arrived, the power had returned, and Richard was still sitting upright in bed. His family was called, and they arrived within the hour, stunned and overjoyed that he had woken up against all odds. But Daniel, his nephew, felt uneasy. There was something off about his uncle. The way he moved, the way his head tilted at odd angles when someone spoke to him, the way he blinked too slowly, as if each motion was being carefully calculated. And then there was the staring. Richard never stopped watching the corners of the room. Not the people, not the doctors or the family members who spoke to him, just the corners. It was subtle at first. Something Daniel thought was just a side effect of waking up from a coma. But over the next 2 days, it got worse. When his mother spoke to Richard, he would respond in clipped, delayed sentences, as if he had to think about every word before saying it. And sometimes, when he wasn't looking, Daniel caught Richard mouthing silent words to himself. The worst part, Daniel started hearing things at night. Low murmurs, like distant voices speaking in hushed, rhythmic tones. They slithered into his dreams, into his waking moments when he was sure he was alone. He never caught the words, only the sound. Part 3. The Midnight Visitor. On the third night, Daniel woke up to the feeling of being watched. His heart pounded as his eyes adjusted to the darkness of his bedroom. The streetlights outside cast long, eerie shadows against his walls. And then he saw him, standing in his doorway. Richard, his uncle's smiling face, was barely illuminated by the hallway light. His hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching in slow, rhythmic movements. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Richard took a step forward. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Uncle Richard?" A pause. And then, in a voice that sounded not quite right, Richard whispered something that made Daniel's blood turn to ice. "I'm back," he said. Then, in the same breath, in a tone so hollow and wrong that it barely sounded human, "But I don't think I came alone." Daniel's hands clenched into fists beneath his blanket. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, to do something, but his body refused. Then, Richard's head jerked to the side, unnaturally fast, as if he had heard something in the room that Daniel could not. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Daniel lay awake until morning. Part 4. The Security Footage. The next day, Daniel refused to be alone in the house. His mother and the rest of the family chalked up Richard's strange behavior to coma-related disorientation, but Daniel knew better. Something wasn't right. That evening, as he scrolled through his phone in an attempt to distract himself, he received a message from one of the hospital nurses who had taken care of Richard. A video file was attached. Daniel hesitated before pressing play. The grainy security footage showed the hospital room at 3:07 a.m., the night Richard had woken up. The video played normally at first. Richard lying motionless in bed, the quiet hum of medical equipment filling the screen. Then, the monitors began to glitch, and suddenly, there were two Richards. One still lying in bed, the other standing beside the bed, watching himself. Daniel's breath hitched. The standing Richard turned his head toward the camera, and for a split second, his face wasn't human. Not in the way a distortion would be. It was too smooth, too pale. The eyes black voids that seemed to stretch unnaturally across his features. Then, the standing Richard stepped forward, and the screen cut to static. Daniel dropped his phone. He knew what the nurse had just told him was true. His real uncle never left that hospital. But something else did. Part 5. The Disappearance. The next morning, Richard was gone. His mother found his hospital bed empty. The sheets pulled back as if he had simply walked out in the middle of the night. But the doors were locked, the windows untouched. There were no footprints, no security footage of him leaving, just his empty bed. His mother filed a missing persons report, but Daniel knew the truth. His uncle had been wrong since the moment he woke up. And now, somewhere out there, the thing that had taken his place was waiting. Daniel never saw his uncle again, but sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear it. A whisper at his bedroom door, a voice too familiar to be ignored. "I came back, Daniel." A long pause, but not alone. Story 2. The Whispering Hole. Part 1. The Forgotten Well. James had always been fascinated by abandoned places. Ever since he was a kid, he'd been drawn to forgotten buildings, decayed farmhouses, and overgrown train tracks. His curiosity often led him into places most people wouldn't dare to go. So when he and his two best friends, Mark and Lucas, stumbled upon an old, dried-up well deep in the woods, James was immediately intrigued. The well was massive, made of cracked stone, covered in creeping vines, and hidden among a grove of skeletal trees. It looked ancient, like it had been there long before the town even existed. Lucas threw a rock inside, expecting the familiar clunk of stone hitting the bottom. But there was nothing, just silence. Mark frowned. Shouldn't we have heard it hit something? James peered over the edge, a strange feeling creeping over him. Maybe it's deeper than we think. Lucas smirked. Or maybe something swallowed it. They all laughed, but the uneasy feeling in James's stomach didn't fade. That's when they heard it, a soft, whispering sound, drifting up from the darkness. Faint at first, then clearer. Help me. Part 2. Voices in the dark. The three friends froze. James felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The voice was childlike, desperate, yet distant, as if it wasn't coming from the well, but from somewhere beyond it. Mark swallowed hard. Did you hear that? Lucas forced a laugh. It's just the wind. Sound bounces in weird ways down in holes. But even as he spoke, the whispering grew louder. Help me, please. I can't get out. James's breath hitched. It sounded closer now. Too close. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the well. The beam barely penetrated the suffocating blackness. Then, for a split second, he saw it. Fingers. Long, thin fingers, pale as bone, reaching upward. He yelped and stumbled backward. Mark grabbed his arm. What? What did you see? James pointed a shaking hand at the well. Something's down there. Lucas peered inside. But the darkness was too thick, swallowing the light like a bottomless pit. Maybe it's a trapped animal, Lucas suggested, but his voice wasn't steady anymore. Then, the whispers changed. They were no longer pleading. They were laughing. Low, wet, guttural laughter. Part 3. Something is coming up. James's stomach turned to ice. The whispering had sounded human before, but now it sounded like something pretending to be human. Mark grabbed his arm. We need to get out of here. Now. Lucas, still skeptical, pulled out his phone. I'm recording this. If we're going crazy, at least we'll have proof. He turned on the voice recorder, holding the phone over the edge. The laughter stopped. Silence. Lucas frowned. Maybe it's... Then a deep, guttural voice, not a whisper, rumbled from the darkness. I see you. James felt his legs give out as a hand shot up from the well, grabbing Lucas's wrist. It wasn't human. The skin was gray, leathery, stretched too tight over its bony structure. The fingers were too long, tipped with jagged nails. It pulled hard, yanking Lucas forward. Lucas screamed, trying to pull away, but the thing was strong. Mark grabbed Lucas's other arm and yanked him back. James, still shaking, picked up a nearby rock and slammed it down onto the hand. There was a horrible, sickening crunch. The hand jerked away, retreating into the darkness. Lucas stumbled back, gasping, his face pale. What the hell was that? No one spoke. Then they heard it, the sound of something climbing. Part 4. Running for their lives. James didn't need to say anything. They ran. The whispering followed them. It was no longer coming from the well. It was in the trees, in the air, slithering inside their heads. You can't run forever. James tripped over a root, crashing hard onto the ground. Mark and Lucas turned back to help him, but he saw their faces go pale. "James," Lucas whispered, voice shaking. "Behind you." James turned his head slowly. A figure was standing by the well. Not standing, hovering. It was tall, too tall. Its body was thin, its head tilted at a nightmarish angle. Its mouth was stretched into a permanent grin, revealing jagged, two white teeth. And it was watching them. Then it took a step forward. James scrambled to his feet. "Run!" The boys bolted through the trees, their lungs burning, their legs aching. But the whispering never stopped. Always right behind them, always getting closer. Part 5. The Cemented Secret. They burst out of the woods and ran straight to Mark's house. Locked the doors, closed the blinds. Lucas collapsed onto the floor, panting. What the hell was that? What the hell was that? James was shaking too hard to answer. They sat in silence for what felt like hours. Then Lucas pulled out his phone. I recorded it," he whispered. "We have proof." He hit play. Silence. Not even the sound of their voices. Just nothing. Then, suddenly, a single, distorted whisper came through the speaker. "I let you go, but not forever." Lucas dropped the phone like it had burned him. None of them spoke about the well after that night. A week later, construction crews showed up out of nowhere. Without explanation, they sealed off the well with cement. No one questioned it. No one talked about it. James never went back into those woods again. But sometimes, when he was alone at night, he swore he could still hear the whispering, soft, distant, and always waiting. Story 3. The Face in My Window. Part 1. The New Apartment. Marie had always been a night owl. Working late shifts at the hospital meant she often came home when the world was asleep. She loved the silence, the stillness of the city at night. The way the buildings stood like silent guardians over the streets below. When she moved into her new apartment on the 7th floor, she thought it was perfect. A cozy little place with a balcony that overlooked the city skyline. Large windows that let in the soft, amber glow of streetlights. A quiet neighborhood with barely any foot traffic. It felt safe. At least, that's what she thought. Until the face appeared. Part 2. The First Night. The first time Marie saw it, she thought it was a trick of the light. She had just gotten home from work, exhausted, and was brushing her teeth when she felt it, that strange, nagging sensation of being watched. At first, she ignored it. It was late, she was tired, and paranoia was normal when you lived alone. But then, as she glanced up at her bathroom mirror, something caught her eye. A reflection, but not hers. In the window behind her, a face stared back at her. Not a reflection, a real face. Outside, Marie's blood ran ice cold. Her apartment was on the 7th floor. No one should be able to be outside her window. She spun around, heart pounding, but when she looked directly at the glass, nothing, just the empty night sky and the twinkling city lights below. She let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. "I need sleep." She convinced herself it was just a hallucination, a side effect of working too many night shifts. But deep down, something felt wrong. She closed the blinds and went to bed. Part 3. 2:43 a.m. Marie had never been a heavy sleeper. She was used to waking up at odd hours, but this was different. It started with a tap, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the window. Marie's eyes fluttered open, her pulse quickening. The apartment was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Then another tap. She sat up, staring at the window across from her bed. The blinds were partially open, just enough to see a sliver of the night outside. She held her breath, and that's when she saw it. A face, just beyond the window, pressed against the glass, watching her. Marie's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't just a face, it was her own. But it wasn't right. The eyes were too wide, the mouth stretched into a twisted grin, the skin too pale, too smooth, like a porcelain mask. Then it blinked. Marie screamed. She leaped from her bed, grabbing the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the window. Crash! The sound shattered the silence, and when she looked back, nothing, no reflection, no face, just an empty window and the cold night beyond. Part 4. The Neighbor's Warning. The next morning, Marie called maintenance. A part of her hoped they would find some rational explanation, maybe a cracked window pane, a bird, something. But the maintenance guy, an older man named Mr. Harris, frowned when he heard her story. "You saw the face," he muttered, almost too quietly. Marie's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Mr. Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not the first tenant who's seen it." Her skin went cold. "People on this floor, they report seeing someone outside their windows. Always at night. Always at 2:43 a.m. Marie swallowed. "That's exactly when I saw it." Mr. Harris nodded grimly. "A woman who lived in your unit years ago?" She jumped. Marie felt her breath catch. "They say she still looks for a way back in." Part 5. The Second Visit. Marie tried to brush it off. It had to be sleep paralysis, stress, or maybe just a nightmare. But deep down she knew. And then it happened again. 3 nights later. 2:43 a.m. The tap, tap, tap woke her instantly. Dread curled in her stomach as she sat up in bed. She knew what was waiting for her. Slowly, with a racing heart, she turned her head toward the window. And there it was, the face. Closer. This time, the eyes weren't just watching. They were staring into her. The mouth moved, stretching in an unnatural way, whispering something she couldn't hear. Marie couldn't breathe. She felt her body freeze in place, trapped in an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Then, the glass cracked. A thin, hairline fracture slithered across the window, and suddenly, the blinds snapped open on their own. The face smiled, and this time, she heard it. "Let me in." Part 6. The Final Night. Marie left her apartment the next day. She didn't pack. She didn't even turn off the lights. She just left. When she returned a week later with a friend, she found something waiting for her. The window was shattered, but what made her blood turn to ice was what was written on the glass. Not on the inside, on the outside, for words, traced in something dark and wet. "I climbed for you." Marie never spent another night there. The apartment remained empty for months after she moved out. No one stayed for long. But no matter how many new tenants came and went, the reports never stopped. Always at night, always at 2:43 a.m., and always the same whisper, "Let me in." Story 4. The Thing That Looked Like My Dad. Part 1. The Wrong Voice. Lisa was used to being home alone. Her father traveled frequently for work, and ever since her mother had passed away, it was just the two of them. The house was old but familiar, and despite its occasional creaks and groans, she never felt unsafe. That changed one night when she was home alone and heard her father's voice call her name from the kitchen. "Lisa," he called. Calm, familiar, but there was one problem. Her dad was out of town. Lisa sat up in bed, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She told herself she had imagined it. Maybe she had been half asleep. Maybe it was a trick of her mind. Then, the voice called again. "Lisa," a little closer this time. A little too close. Lisa's stomach turned to ice. Her dad was supposed to be hundreds of miles away. So, who's calling her? Part 2. The kitchen encounter. She hesitated before getting out of bed. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to stay put. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. She crept out of her room and padded down the hallway, her socks making no sound against the wooden floor. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. And then she saw him, standing in the kitchen. Her father, or at least something that looked like him. The longer she stared, the more she realized something was off. His arms hung at his sides, too stiff, like a puppet waiting to be moved. His head was tilted too far, as if his neck was struggling to hold up the weight. And then there was his smile. It stretched too wide, frozen, as if it had been painted onto his face. Lisa's breath hitched. Her father wasn't supposed to be home. And yet, here he was, or something that looked like him. Then it spoke. "You saw me, didn't you?" Part 3. The wrong eyes. Lisa's blood turned to ice. The voice was almost right. Almost. But there was something wrong about it. Something hollow. Something too careful. Like it was copying his tone but missing the subtle details that made it human. She took a step back. The figure didn't move. It just watched her. And that's when she noticed the eyes. Her father had warm brown eyes. But this thing's eyes were black. Not dark brown, solid black. Like pits. Like there was nothing behind them. Lisa's throat went dry. She took another step back, inching toward the hallway. The thing tilted its head. And then, in the same hollow, careful voice, it said, "Are you afraid?" Lisa turned and ran. Part 4. The phone call. She slammed the door to her bedroom and locked it, pressing her back against the wood. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone. She called her father. The dial tone buzzed once, twice, then, "Lisa?" His voice was groggy, confused. Relief crashed over her like a wave. "Dad?" "What's wrong?" he asked, concern creeping into his tone. Tears pricked at her eyes. "Dad, are you home?" A pause. Then, "What?" "No, sweetheart. I'm still in Chicago." "Why?" Lisa's stomach dropped. Her voice shook. "There's someone in the house." Another pause. Then, in a voice sharper than she'd ever heard before, her father said, "Lisa, whatever you do, don't open the door." She sucked in a breath. Something knocked on the door. Once, twice, soft, careful, like it was testing the boundary between them. And then the voice came again, her father's voice. "Lisa?" But this time, it was right outside the door. Part 5. The shadow under the door. Lisa covered her mouth with both hands, forcing herself not to scream. She could hear it. The slow, deliberate breathing. She looked down at the crack beneath the door. A shadow stretched across the floor. Not the kind a person casts when they stand in front of a light. This shadow moved on its own. It flickered, twitched, and then it slid under the door. Lisa didn't think. She bolted for the closet, heart hammering, and shoved herself inside. The room outside was silent. Then she heard it, soft footsteps, moving toward the closet. Then the door handle rattled. Part 6, The Long Night. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. Her hands clamped over her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. The closet door handle twisted back and forth, slow and patient. Then silence. Lisa stayed frozen, every muscle locked. The air felt heavy, thick, like the room itself was holding its breath with her. She waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. She didn't dare move. Eventually, exhaustion took over. She passed out inside the closet. Part 7, The Morning After. When Lisa woke up, sunlight streamed through the window. She sat up, her muscles screaming from the cramped position she had slept in. For a moment, she thought maybe it was a nightmare. Then she saw her bedroom door. It was wide open, and on the floor, something had been written on the wood. 4 words. "You saw me, didn't you?" Lisa ran out of the house. She never went back. Part 8, The Aftermath. Lisa moved in with a friend. She told no one what had happened. She didn't need to, because even though she was miles away, living in a new place, in a new bed, she still heard it. At night, just beyond the door, a soft knock, and a voice that sounded just like her father's. Lisa, but she knew. She knew it wasn't him. It never was. And whatever it was, it still hadn't given up. Some horror stories end when the video stops playing, but others, they follow you. Tonight, we've uncovered 4 disturbing, true, scary stories. Tales of paranormal encounters, eerie doppelgangers, and terrifying real-life horror experiences. But the question remains, how many of these stories were just stories? And how many were warnings? If you made it this far, you're braver than most. But tell me, which story disturbed you the most? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you've had your own unexplained horror experience, share it in the comments if you dare. Enjoy disturbing, true, scary stories like this? Make sure to subscribe for more terrifying real-life horror content. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new nightmare. Hit the like button, unless you're afraid of what's lurking in the dark. More creepy stories await you.